The kitchen smelled like rosemary and dish soap the way it always did on Tuesday evenings. Catherine Whitmore had spent 27 years building small rituals into the architecture of her marriage. The rosemary chicken on Tuesdays, the French press coffee on Sunday mornings, the way she always left Richard's reading glasses on the right side of the kitchen counter so he wouldn't have to look for them. These were not grand gestures. They were the quiet language of a life constructed around someone else's comfort. And she had spoken that language so fluently for so long that she no longer noticed she was doing it. She was standing at the sink, rinsing the last of the dinner plates, when she heard the particular silence that meant Richard had something to say. Not the comfortable silence of two people who had run out of words because they knew each other too well. This was the held-breath silence of someone who had rehearsed. She turned around. Richard Whitmore sat at the kitchen table with his hands folded in front of him. His posture, the precise posture of a man presenting closing arguments, controlled, deliberate, already decided. He was 57 years old and still carried the lean, angular confidence that had made him impressive in courtrooms across Portland for 3 decades. His silver hair was trimmed close. His expression was unreadable in the practiced way of someone who had spent a career making sure juries could never guess what he was thinking. Catherine. His voice was level, not cold exactly, but stripped of warmth the way a room is stripped of furniture before a move. I want a divorce. The plate she was holding didn't drop. She set it down carefully on the drying rack, the ceramic clicking softly against the metal. For a moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the drip of the faucet she hadn't fully turned off. She had not seen this coming. Or perhaps, and this thought would visit her many times in the weeks that followed, she had simply refused to look directly at it the way you avoid looking at a structural crack in a wall. Because acknowledging it means accepting that the whole thing might come down. I don't understand, she said. And her own voice surprised her, how ordinary it sounded. How calm, as though her body had decided to handle this conversation professionally, even before her mind had caught up. Richard exhaled through his nose, a small sound that carried the unmistakable texture of impatience. The marriage hasn't been working for a long time. He spoke the sentence carefully, as though he had tested it for weaknesses before deploying it. I think on some level you know that. Catherine stood very still. She was 54 years old, and she had the particular stillness of a woman who had learned that the fastest way to understand a room was to stop filling it with noise. She let the silence expand between them and watched his face, looking for some tremor of regret, some micro-expression of guilt that would make this feel human. She found nothing. Richard had always been extraordinarily good at deciding something and then simply living inside the decision, sealed off from second-guessing. There is someone else. He said it the way you deliver a legal disclosure, necessary, unpleasant, dispatched. The kitchen seemed to tighten around her. The warm September light coming through the window over the sink. The light she had always loved for the way it turned. The old oak cabinet's amber in the evenings suddenly felt irrelevant, like a set decoration for a scene that no longer made sense. Who? She said. It wasn't quite a question. It came out flat, like a word spoken into a room with no echo. Richard's jaw shifted almost imperceptibly. Her name is Brooke. She's 24. He paused for the length of exactly one breath. She's driven. She knows what she wants from her life. The implication arrived without being stated, unlike you. Catherine did not respond immediately. She was doing the arithmetic without wanting to. 24. She was 54. Brooke was 30 years younger. Closer in age to their daughter than to Catherine herself. The number didn't produce rage, not yet. It produced something closer to vertigo, the specific dizziness of realizing that the ground you were standing on was not the ground you believed it to be. You've been planning this, she said. Again, not a question. Richard reached down beside his chair and lifted a leather briefcase onto the table, the same briefcase he had carried for 15 years. The one she had given him as a gift when he made partner. He opened it and removed a manila folder, setting it on the table and sliding it across to her. with the smooth efficiency of a man who had made this gesture hundreds of times in professional settings. "Those are the divorce papers," he said. "My attorney has already filed. I wanted to give you the courtesy of a conversation before you received formal notification." Courtesy. The word sat in the room like something that had been left in the wrong place. Catherine opened the folder without sitting down. She read, standing up, one hand still damp from the dishes, the pages rustling softly under her fingers. She read slowly because Catherine Whitmore had learned young that the most dangerous documents were the ones that seemed straightforward. Her father had taught her that. "Read everything twice," he used to say, sitting across from her at the desk in his study, the afternoon light falling across financial reports she didn't yet have the language to understand. "The first time you see what it says, the second time you see what it means." What it meant was this: Richard had structured his financial life with the precision of someone who had been building an exit for a long time. The house in the Laurelhurst neighborhood, the one they had bought together 18 years ago, the one where she had painted the back bedroom herself when their daughter was born, was held in the name of a limited liability entity connected to Richard's firm. The investment accounts that Catherine had vaguely understood as joint assets were on paper, intertwined with Richard's professional partnerships in ways that made them effectively untouchable. The retirement funds carried legal protections she had never examined because she had trusted him not to make examination necessary. The settlement proposal offered her a fixed monthly payment for a period of 5 years. No claim to the house, no share of the firm's assets, no long-term financial security of any kind. She closed the folder. She looked at her husband of 27 years across the kitchen table. "You've been preparing this for a long time," she said. "I've been practical," he replied. "I'd encourage you to be the same." Something settled in her chest, then not acceptance, not defeat, but a cold and clarifying anger that she kept entirely off her face. Because Richard believed, with the complete confidence of a man who had spent 3 decades winning arguments, that he understood exactly who Catherine Whitmore was. He believed she was uncomplicated, predictable, a woman who taught watercolor classes to children at the Eastside Community Arts Center, who drove a 7-year-old Subaru, who had never once demanded a larger share of the life they built together. He believed that the woman he was leaving would read this folder, and after a period of appropriate grief, sign whatever he placed in front of her. He was operating on a model of her that was 27 years out of date. And what he did not know, what no one knew, including Catherine herself, was that the model had never been accurate to begin with. She set the folder back on the table, squarely aligned with the edge. "I'll review the documents," she said. "I'll want my own attorney to look at them." Something moved behind Richard's eyes, surprise maybe, or the recalibration of someone who had expected tears. "Of course," he said. "That's reasonable." He stood, picked up his briefcase. "I'll be staying elsewhere while you arrange for your next steps." She did not ask where elsewhere was. She already knew it would be the penthouse she hadn't known about yet. After he left, Catherine sat at the kitchen table for a long time in the dark. She did not cry. She looked at the folder in front of her and thought about her father, who had died when she was 32 years old, who had held her hand in the hospital and told her that the people who love you always leave something behind that you won't understand until you need it. She had thought he was speaking about memory. She had been wrong about that too. Her best friend Diane Foster called at 8:15 the next morning, which meant Diane had been awake since at least 6, working up to the call. Diane had known Catherine since their freshman year at the University of Oregon, and she was one of those rare people who deliver difficult news with a particular combination of directness and gentleness that made you feel informed rather than ambushed. "Cat," she said as soon as Catherine picked up, "please tell me you're sitting down." The tone told Catherine everything about what was coming before a single specific fact arrived. The Instagram account was called Brooke Calloway, and it had 43,000 followers. The profile photo showed a young woman with long honey blonde hair, and the easy, expensive-looking confidence of someone whose life had been organized around being looked at. The most recent post was 3 weeks old, a rooftop photograph downtown Portland skyline behind them. Richard in a charcoal blazer with his arm around Brooke's waist, both of them holding champagne glasses with the practiced casualness of people who knew the camera was there. The caption read, "New beginnings with my favorite person." 3 weeks ago, Catherine had made rosemary chicken. Diane had done more than find the account. She had spent what was clearly a focused morning tracking down property records. The glass tower on the South Park blocks with the penthouse units that started at $3 million and the lobby that looked like the interior of a Scandinavian hotel. Richard had purchased a unit there 8 weeks ago. The deed was filed under the same LLC structure that held the Laurelhurst house. He had signed the papers on a Thursday afternoon in July. Catherine could not remember what she had been doing that particular Thursday, but she knew with certainty it had been ordinary. She had probably been teaching a class. She scrolled through Brooke's account for a long time after she hung up with Diane. There were pictures from before Richard beach vacations, restaurant openings, the visual shorthand of a young woman building a brand out of her life. And then beginning about 14 months ago, a subtle shift: better hotels, a different quality of restaurant, a fur-lined coat that cost more than Catherine's monthly income. The timeline of Richard's planning made itself visible in the photographs of another woman's life. She put the phone down on the kitchen counter. She stood in the morning light and felt something she hadn't expected to feel, which was not devastation, but clarity. A sudden and almost uncomfortable sharpening of vision, as though the prescription on a pair of glasses she'd been wearing for decades had just been corrected, and she was seeing the room for the first time at full resolution. She picked up the folder from the table. She read it a second time the way her father had taught her. Then she opened her laptop and began searching for divorce attorneys who specialized in complex asset structures. The text message arrived at 11:47 that morning, while she was on hold with the law firm's intake coordinator. The number was unfamiliar, a Portland area code she didn't recognize. The message was brief. "Catherine Whitmore. My name is Gerald Holt. I served as a state counsel for Harold Whitfield for many years. I need to speak with you at your earliest convenience. This is a matter of some urgency." She read the message twice. Harold Whitfield, her father, dead for 22 years, and his lawyer was texting her the morning after her husband told her he wanted a divorce with an urgency that the measured professional phrasing could not quite conceal. The rational explanation was obvious. Some routine estate administration detail, a document that needed a signature, some minor legal thread that had gone unresolved for decades. She told herself this while she set the phone face down on the counter and returned to her hold music. She told herself this through the rest of the morning. She was still telling herself this when she finally called Gerald Holt back at 3 in the afternoon. And the steadiness of his voice when he answered, the particular steadiness of someone managing very significant news, made her understand that this was not routine in any sense of that word. "I've been following the legal developments regarding your marital situation," he said after the initial formalities. "I want to be transparent with you about that. My firm has certain monitoring responsibilities related to your financial standing, and when the divorce filing appeared in the court records, I knew I needed to contact you promptly." "Monitoring responsibilities," she repeated. "I'll explain everything in person," he said. "There are documents I need to show you, and there's a letter your father wrote that belongs to you. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning?" She wrote down the address. When she put the phone down, she stood in her kitchen for a long moment looking at the half-finished canvas propped against the wall of the small back room she used as a studio, a landscape she had been working on for weeks. The Columbia River Gorge in autumn, the light on the water not quite right yet. Her father had loved that drive. He used to take her out along the historic Columbia River Highway on Sunday mornings when she was a girl. The two of them quiet together in the car, her father pointing occasionally at the light on the cliffs. without explaining why it mattered, simply trusting that she would understand. She picked up a brush, turned it over in her fingers, set it back down. She had not thought seriously about her father's financial arrangements in years. When Harold Whitfield died, she had been 32 years old, newly married, consumed by grief and by the beginning of her life with Richard. The trust had appeared, as if part of the machinery of loss, a monthly deposit in her bank account, modest but consistent, the kind of financial arrangement that felt like a quiet form of ongoing love. Richard had been dismissive of it from the beginning. The man had real money, and he left you a stipend, he had said once with the casual contempt of someone who believed that all financial arrangements were at bottom statements about a person's worth. Catherine had defended her father then. She had said that Harold was careful, that he valued privacy, that not every wealthy person needed to announce themselves. Richard had moved on to other topics, but the comment had left a small residue, a faint, persistent doubt about whether she had ever really understood the shape of her father's life. Tomorrow, apparently, she was going to find out. That night, she walked through the house slowly, room by room, the way you walk through a place you are preparing to leave. The study where Richard kept his law books, the guest bedroom that still held the furniture his mother had left behind, the living room with the built-in shelves she had spent a weekend painting herself in the third year of their marriage, the cream paint she had mixed herself to match the trim. There was a photograph on the shelf above the fireplace, their 20th anniversary taken in Napa Valley, by a stranger they had asked to borrow a phone. Richard had his arm around her shoulders, and they were both squinting into the afternoon sun, both smiling, and Catherine remembered that day as genuinely happy. She remembered thinking, standing on that hillside with her husband's arm around her, that this was what durability looked like. She took the photograph off the shelf and set it face down on the coffee table, not in anger, just because looking at it required something she didn't have to spare right now. She went to her studio and sat on the stool in front of the unfinished landscape. The room smelled like linseed oil and turpentine and dried paint. The smell that had been the background scent of her interior life for 30 years. She had started painting seriously in college, had put it aside during the early years of Richard's career, when money was tight and time was tighter, had returned to it when their daughter started school. For 2 decades now, teaching watercolor and acrylic to children and adults at the community center had been the part of her week she protected most fiercely. Richard had never understood that. He had moved through phases of dismissing it outright, then tolerating it, then occasionally weaponizing it, using the modesty of her income as a way of establishing the hierarchy of their household's contributions. She had never argued back, partly because she had made her peace with living in a world that valued Richard's billable hours more than her Tuesday afternoons, with kids who discovered, often for the first time, that their hands could make something beautiful. And partly because she had believed, without quite examining the belief, that the hierarchy Richard described was an accurate description of reality. She was beginning to suspect that the hierarchy had been accurate only because Richard had constructed it to be. She picked up the brush. She looked at the river in the painting. The light still wrung on the water, too flat, not capturing the particular quality of October light that turned the Columbia into something molten and ancient. She thought about her father, who had pointed at that same water from a car window when she was 8 years old, who had said something she had never forgotten. The most powerful things in the world are the ones that don't announce themselves. She had assumed he was talking about rivers. She began to paint. The morning of her appointment with Gerald Holt, she received a call from Richard's attorney, a man named Patterson, with the crisp, managing tone of someone accustomed to dealing with the weaker party in a negotiation. He was calling to ensure she had received the documents, to remind her of the response timeline, and to note that Richard hoped the process could proceed without unnecessary complication. The word unnecessary did a lot of work in that sentence. Catherine listened without interrupting, and when Patterson finished, she said in a voice that was perfectly pleasant, "I'll have my attorney respond in due course." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. You've retained someone, Patterson asked. The surprise in his voice was visible enough to see. I will have, she said. Thank you for calling. She ended the call and got in her car. Gerald Holt's office was on the 32nd floor of a building in the Pearl District. The kind of building with marble floors in the lobby and the particular quiet of serious money being quietly managed. The receptionist directed her upstairs without asking for identification, which suggested Gerald had been expecting her with some anticipation. He was standing when she entered the conference room. A man in his late 60s, silver-haired with the compact, precise bearing of someone who had spent decades carrying significant information carefully. He extended his hand, and his grip was warm and firm. Catherine, he said, thank you for coming. Your father spoke of you often. He gestured toward the chair across the table. There's quite a lot I need to explain, and I want to take the time to do it properly. On the table in front of him sat a thick folder with her name printed on the front in a font that suggested it had been prepared carefully, not hastily. Beside the folder sat a sealed envelope. In her father's handwriting in ink that had faded to the particular brown of old age for Catherine. If her marriage ends. She looked at the envelope for a long moment before she looked back at Gerald. My father expected this, she said. Gerald's expression was careful, measured, and something beneath it was very close to sorrow. Your father prepared for it, he said. That's not quite the same thing, though. I understand why the distinction might not feel meaningful right now. He opened the folder. Harold Whitfield, he explained, had not been merely a private investor in the comfortable upper-middle-class sense that Catherine had always assumed. He had founded a company called Whitfield Capital Group in 1983, building it slowly and deliberately over the following 4 decades. The company operated as a private investment entity under a multi-tiered LLC structure, entirely legal, designed for maximum discretion, the kind of architecture used by families who understood that visibility was a liability. It had no public profile, no media presence, no name recognition outside the specific networks of institutional investors and fund managers who had worked with it directly. The portfolio was concentrated entirely within the United States. Commercial real estate in Chicago and Denver. A medical research facility outside Seattle developing early detection diagnostics for neurological disease. 3 applied technology schools in rural communities across the Midwest, built on Harold's conviction that the most transformative educational investments were the ones made in places no one was looking. A clean energy development project spanning Nevada and Arizona, started a decade before renewable energy became a fashionable investment category. None of it had been built to generate headlines. All of it had been built to last. The current estimated value of the portfolio was $2.1 billion. Catherine sat very still across the table from Gerald Holt and let that number occupy the room. If this company exists and it's been operating for 40 years, why have I never heard of it? She asked. Why didn't my father tell me? Gerald explained that Harold had made a deliberate decision early in Catherine's life, watching friends whose children had grown up knowing the scale of what they would inherit, watching what that knowledge had done to those children's choices, their relationships, their sense of their own capability. Harold had wanted Catherine to make decisions about her life based on what she wanted, not on what she was going to have. He had wanted her marriage, if she married, to be chosen for the right reasons. The trust had been structured accordingly. The monthly payments she had been receiving since Harold's death were real, and they had provided real stability, but they were a fraction of what existed. The remainder was held in trust under conditions that would release control only when specific circumstances were met. What circumstances? Catherine said. Gerald placed a document in front of her. At the top, in formal legal language that she read twice before she understood it fully, the conditions were outlined. Full control of Whitfield Capital Group would transfer to Catherine Whitmore upon the legal dissolution of her marriage. She looked up from the document. There's more, Gerald said. He turned to another page. Your father understood that if a divorce ever occurred, you would need resources immediately, not after the process concluded. He didn't want you entering a legal battle without the means to fight it properly. He indicated a separate clause, a first-year activation triggered not by the finalization of divorce, but by the filing of divorce proceedings. Upon that filing, a separate fund of $500,000 became accessible to Catherine, immediately designated explicitly for legal representation and personal financial stability during the proceedings. The filing happened 3 days ago, Gerald said. The first-year funds are available to you now. Catherine placed both hands flat on the table. She breathed carefully. She thought about her father's hands, the way he used to hold a pen precisely, deliberately, with the focused attention of a man who understood that words on paper were binding in ways that spoken words were not. He knew Richard, she said. It wasn't a question. Gerald was quiet for a moment. He met Richard twice before your wedding, he said. He told me afterward that Richard was intelligent, capable, and very good at understanding what a room expected of him. He paused. He also told me that Richard had the specific quality of a person who organized the world according to what he could gain from it. Harold worried that your patience and your generosity would read to a man like that as an absence of demands. He worried that you would give without measuring, and that Richard would take without noticing. 27 years of small rituals. The reading glasses on the right side of the counter. The Tuesday rosemary chicken. The paint she had mixed herself to match the living room trim. He wasn't wrong, Catherine said. Gerald shook his head gently. No, but he also never stopped hoping he was. He slid the sealed envelope across the table. She picked it up and turned it over. The paper was heavy, cream-colored, the kind her father had always preferred for correspondence he considered important. She opened the envelope at the table because she had inherited from Harold Whitfield the belief that difficult things were not improved by postponing them. The letter was one page, written in her father's precise, slightly old-fashioned script. He began without preamble. My dear Catherine, if you are reading this, your marriage has ended. First, I am sorry. No father wants this for his daughter. And whatever I understood about Richard Whitmore, I never stopped hoping that understanding was incomplete. He wrote about what he had seen in Richard, not cruelty, not malice, but something he considered in some ways more difficult, to live with a person for whom other people were primarily resources to be assessed and optimized. He wrote that he had watched this quality in many people over the course of his career, that it often coexisted with genuine intelligence and even genuine charm, but that it had a particular way of making the people who loved its owner invisible over time. He wrote, "You were never invisible to me. I want you to know that the woman you are, the one who teaches children to see the world through color, who mixes her own paint to get the light exactly right, who has never once measured her worth by what she owned, is the woman I am most proud to have raised. The money I am leaving you is not a judgment about what your life should become. It is a door I am leaving unlocked in case you ever need it." The final paragraph was brief. I believe the right person will
It's
come into
so
your
good to
life one
see
day.
you. You
Someone who
too.
will
I've
know your
missed our
value long
chats.
before they
Me
ever
too.
know
We
your
should do
net
this more
worth.
often.
Until then, live freely, trust your own vision, and never let anyone convince you that simplicity is the same as smallness. Your father. Catherine folded the letter along its original creases and placed it back in the envelope. She held it in both hands for a moment. The morning light was coming through the tall windows of the conference room, falling across the table at the same angle it fell through the kitchen window at home, the light she had always loved for what it did to wood. She looked up at Gerald Holt. "What do I do now?" she said. Gerald opened the folder to a fresh section, and for the next 40 minutes, he explained the legal structure of what was coming, the formal transfer process, the role of Nathan Cole, who had been managing Whitfield Capital Group's daily operations for the 15 years since Harold's death. He explained that Catherine would not be expected to step in as an operational executive, that the management team was experienced and stable, that her role would be one of strategic direction rather than daily administration. He explained that Richard could not touch any of it. The trust predated the marriage by 12 years. Under Oregon law and under the legal architecture, Harold had spent years designing and refining the assets existed entirely outside the scope of marital property. "Your father was not only careful," Gerald said, "he was extraordinarily thorough." Catherine stood. She smoothed the front of her jacket. She picked up the envelope with her father's letter and placed it carefully in her bag. "I'd like to meet Nathan Cole," she said, "this week if possible." Gerald's expression shifted to something that might have been relief. "I'll arrange it," he said. "I think he'll be glad to finally meet you." She took the elevator down alone. In the lobby, the marble floors reflected the gray Portland morning through the glass doors. She walked to her car, sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine, and looked at the envelope in her bag. Richard Whitmore had spent the past year building an exit from their marriage. He had purchased a penthouse, structured his assets, rehearsed his lines, and filed his paperwork. He had done all of this with the confidence of a man who believed he understood every variable in the equation. He had not accounted for a sealed envelope in a filing cabinet, and a father who had loved his daughter well enough to think 30 years ahead. Catherine started the car. Nathan Cole's office occupied a corner of the fourth floor of a building so deliberately understated that Catherine drove past it twice before finding the entrance. No signage on the exterior beyond a small brass plate beside the door. Whitfield Capital Group LLC, the kind of identification that assumed you already knew where you were going. The building sat 2 blocks from the waterfront in the Northwest District, surrounded by the kind of quiet that comes not from absence, but from intention. Nathan met her in the lobby himself, rather than sending a receptionist. He was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered with the particular calm of someone who had made enough consequential decisions over enough years that urgency no longer lived in his posture. He wore no tie. His handshake was direct. When he looked at her, he did not look at her the way people had been looking at her for the past 2 days with the careful managing attention of someone calculating how much she could absorb. He looked at her the way you look at someone you have been waiting to meet for a long time and are now simply glad to see. "Your father talked about you more than he talked about almost anything else," he said as he walked her toward the conference room. "He kept a painting you made in college on the wall of his office. Boat on the Willamette, early morning light. He never replaced it." She hadn't known that. The information landed somewhere deep and stayed there. For the next 50 minutes, Nathan walked her through the architecture of a company she was going to own. Whitfield Capital Group held positions across 11 domestic sectors. The commercial real estate holdings in Chicago and Denver were managed through a subsidiary that had operated profitably for 23 years. The Seattle Neurological Research Facility had spent the last decade developing non-invasive early detection tools for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Harold's most personal investment, Nathan explained, started 3 years after Harold's own father had died of early-onset dementia. The 3 applied technology schools in rural Montana, Kentucky, and West Virginia had been funded on the theory that the digital economy had drawn a boundary between communities with infrastructure and communities without it, and that the boundary was not inevitable. The Nevada and Arizona Clean Energy Project had been in development for 7 years and was 18 months from its first operational phase. Catherine asked careful, specific questions that surprised Nathan in their precision. She had spent 30 years listening to Richard discuss corporate law at dinner parties and client events, absorbing the vocabulary of institutional finance the way you absorb the grammar of a language you live inside without formally studying. She had never had a reason to deploy it. She had one now. "The management team," she said near the end of the meeting. "How much of this depends on you personally versus the structure Harold built around you?" Nathan considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Harold was careful about that. He didn't want a company that would collapse around a single person. There are 6 division leads who have been here between 8 and 19 years. The institutional knowledge is distributed. What the company needs from you is not operational expertise, it's direction. Harold used to say that the most important decisions a fund makes are the ones about what it refuses to do. She thought about the letter in her bag. The door I am leaving unlocked in case you ever need it. He said something similar to me once, she said. In a different context. I didn't understand what he meant at the time. Nathan smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had worked for Harold Whitfield for 15 years. He had a way of saying things ahead of when they made sense. She left the building at noon with a folder of documents and Nathan's direct number. Her phone rang before she reached her car. Diane, again, and her voice had the tight, controlled quality of someone delivering news they have already processed on your behalf in order to soften the initial impact. Brooke Calloway had posted that morning a photograph of the Laurelhurst house shot from the driveway with a caption about new spaces and fresh starts. Richard had apparently told Brooke that the house would be his, and Brooke had apparently decided to begin publicly claiming a life that was not yet legally hers. Catherine stood beside her car and looked at the photograph on Diane's forwarded link for a long moment. The cream-colored front door she had repainted herself 3 summers ago. The climbing rose on the left side of the porch that had taken 4 years to establish. The window of the back room, where she kept her studio, just visible at the edge of the frame. She felt something move through her that was not grief and not rage, but something more focused than either the specific emotion of a person who has just understood the full dimensions of what is being taken from them, and has simultaneously understood that the person doing the taking is operating without a complete picture. She called the attorney she had spoken to that morning, a woman named Sandra Pierce, who specialized in high-asset divorce litigation and had a reputation in Portland legal circles for a methodical precision that opposing counsel found deeply unpleasant. Catherine retained her that afternoon, using the first-tier fund Gerald had unlocked, and Sandra's first instruction was directed: do not respond to Richard's attorney. Do not respond to Richard directly, and do not under any circumstances sign anything. 3 days before Richard had announced he wanted a divorce, a man named Douglas Hale had been having lunch with a former colleague at a restaurant in the Pearl District. Douglas had been an equity partner at Richard's firm for 11 years, before leaving under circumstances that Richard described publicly as a difference in professional philosophy. What Richard had never fully disclosed was that Douglas's departure had been preceded by a formal internal complaint about Richard's habit of continuing to advise clients in matters where his personal financial interests created undisclosed conflicts. The complaint had gone nowhere inside the firm. Douglas had taken his practice elsewhere and said nothing publicly. He had been watching Richard's career from a careful distance for 3 years. And when the news of Richard's divorce and the subsequent Whitfield Capital headlines began circulating through Portland's legal community, Douglas Hale picked up the phone and called the Oregon State Bar. He had not spoken to Catherine. He did not know her. The call he made was a consequence of his own history with Richard and of the particular disgust that some lawyers feel when they watch a colleague treat the profession's ethics as negotiable. The Professional Conduct Committee opened a formal inquiry into whether Richard had continued representing investment clients with indirect business relationships to Whitfield Capital subsidiaries during the period when he was planning the divorce and privately investigating the scope of Catherine's family assets. The conflict was not simple, but it was real, and it was exactly the kind of thing Richard had believed his seniority made him invisible to. Brooke Calloway's text arrived 4 days after Catherine's meeting with Nathan on a Thursday morning, when she was sitting at the kitchen table reading through financial summaries. The message was short and visibly uncomfortable to have written. Hi, Catherine. I know this is the last thing you expected, but there are things you should probably know about Richard. I'm not trying to cause trouble. I just think you deserve the full picture. Catherine sat with the message for 20 minutes before she responded. She suggested a coffee shop near the waterfront. Brooke agreed within seconds. The cafe was the kind of Portland place that took its coffee seriously, and its ambient noise, minimally pale wood, large windows, the smell of single origin beans ground to order. Brooke was already there when Catherine arrived, seated at a corner table. And without the architecture of Instagram, she looked exactly what she was, a 24-year-old woman who had made a significant miscalculation and was now living inside the consequences. She stood when Catherine approached, her fingers working the cuff of her sweater, her eyes doing a quick assessment of Catherine's expression before she could stop them. Catherine sat down. She ordered coffee. She looked at Brooke across the table with the patient, open attention she used in her classroom when a student was working up to saying something difficult, and she waited. "I didn't know about the money," Brooke said, her voice carrying the particular emphasis of someone making a statement they expect to be disbelieved. "Richard told me your father left you a small trust. That was it. That was everything he said." "I didn't know about it either," Catherine said. "Not the full extent of it." This visibly recalibrated something in Brooke's understanding of the situation. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "He talked about you constantly, not in a..." She stopped, chose different words. "He talked about you like a problem he was trying to solve." Catherine held her coffee cup without drinking from it. "What kind of problem?" Brooke reached into her bag and removed her phone. She turned the screen toward Catherine, and what Catherine saw was a series of text messages, a thread between Brooke and Richard spanning 14 months. The early messages were what you would expect. But beginning about 8 months ago, a pattern emerged. Richard had been asking Brooke specific questions about Catherine's family background, about her father's financial history, about whether Catherine had ever mentioned inheritance structures, private funds, any asset that existed separately from their joint accounts. The questions were framed casually, conversationally, embedded in longer messages about other things, the way a skilled attorney embeds the important question inside a list of unimportant ones. But read consecutively, stripped of the surrounding noise, the intent was unmistakable. Richard had suspected that Harold Whitfield's estate was worth more than Catherine knew. He had spent the better part of a year trying to find the edges of it through a woman he was simultaneously romancing. He had been conducting discovery on his own marriage. "He wasn't leaving you because of me," Brooke said. Her voice was flat now, the flatness of a person who has already grieved the version of a story they preferred. "I was how he was leaving you. There's a difference." Catherine set the phone down on the table between them. The architecture of it was almost impressive in its complete absence of conscience. "You're not the villain in this," Catherine said, "but you're not entirely outside it either." Brooke nodded. She had clearly expected something harsher, and the honesty of what she received instead seemed to land with more weight. "I know." She pulled the phone back and opened a different screen. "There's one more thing." The screenshot showed a message from Richard to his attorney, Patterson. A message that had been sent to Brooke accidentally as part of a chain that included her number. In it, Richard outlined his intention to challenge the trust structure by arguing that Catherine had known about the full scope of the assets during the marriage and had deliberately concealed them as a form of financial fraud. He was planning to accuse her of the thing he had been doing himself. Catherine photographed the screenshot with her own phone. She sent it to Sandra Pierce before she left the table. Sandra's response came within the hour. "This is helpful. We were already prepared for this argument. Now we can bury it." The legal challenge arrived formally 3 weeks later. Patterson filed on Richard's behalf in Multnomah County Circuit Court, arguing that the trust should be subject to equitable distribution on the grounds that Catherine had misrepresented her financial circumstances during the marriage. The filing was dense, carefully worded, and built on a theory that collapsed the moment you examined its foundation, which was that Catherine had known during the marriage what the trust contained. She had not. And Gerald Holt had 22 years of documentation proving it. Sandra filed the response in 4 days. The counter-argument was built on three pillars. The trust had been established in 1983, 12 years before the marriage. The first-tier funds had been released to Catherine only after Richard filed for divorce, meaning she could not have accessed or leveraged the information beforehand. And the screenshot Brooke had provided, which was now part of the formal record, demonstrated that Richard had spent the final year of the marriage actively attempting to investigate assets he suspected existed, dismantling his own claim that he had been deceived. He had not been deceived. He had been looking, and he simply hadn't found what he was looking for in time. 2 weeks after the filing, Catherine received an indirect message through Sandra that Richard was withdrawing the motion. Patterson framed it as a decision to avoid unnecessary litigation costs. Sandra translated this into plain language in their next call. He knows he can't win. He's managing his losses. She went back to the community center on a Wednesday afternoon in the middle of all of it, because Wednesday afternoons had always been hers, and she was not prepared to surrender them to the narrative that her life had become. The building smelled the same as it always had: industrial cleaner beneath the warmer smell of paper and a tempera paint. The particular humidity of a space used by a lot of children. Margaret Delgado, who had been directing the center for 11 years, met her in the hallway with a hug that lasted slightly longer than usual, which was Margaret's way of saying she had seen the news without making Catherine discuss it. In the classroom, 7 children were working on a still life assignment. A bowl of fruit, a piece of fabric. The challenge of rendering texture in watercolor without overworking the paper. A boy named Connor, 9 years old, with the specific intensity of a child who cared very much about getting things right, had flooded his paper with too much water and was staring at the bleeding colors with the particular despair of someone watching something they made go wrong. Catherine pulled a stool next to his table. She looked at the painting without speaking for a moment. The colors that had bled into each other, a blue that had swallowed the edge of an orange, had produced something that bore no resemblance to the bowl of fruit, but had a quality of its own, a luminous accidental quality that the careful work on the other paintings didn't have. "Look at what it actually is," she said, "not what you meant it to be." Connor looked at the painting for a long time. Something shifted in his face, the movement from judgment to attention, from evaluating against a standard to simply seeing. "It looks like the sky, say," he said. "It does," she said. "That's yours. You made that." She taught the rest of the afternoon and did not think about the bar inquiry or the withdrawn motion or the $2.1 billion that was now legally hers. She thought about water and paper and the particular weight of a wet brush, and when the last child left and she sat alone in the quiet classroom with the smell of paint around her, she felt something that had been tight in her chest for 6 weeks, released slightly like a knot worked loose. The courthouse on Southwest 4th Avenue was the kind of building that had absorbed so much human consequence over so many decades that it had developed a specific gravity, not heavy exactly, but weighted the way rooms feel when they have witnessed too many irreversible things. Catherine arrived 20 minutes early and sat in the hall outside the courtroom on a wooden bench that had been worn smooth by generations of people waiting for their lives to be reorganized by a stranger with a gavel. Sandra sat beside her, reviewing documents on a tablet with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times and understood that the routine nature of it on her end was itself a form of comfort to offer a client. Richard and Patterson arrived 7 minutes later. Richard in the charcoal suit he wore when he wanted to project authority without appearing to try. He looked older than he had in September. Not dramatically, the bones of his confidence were still visible, but something behind his eyes had changed, a quality of certainty that had been absolute when he sat at the kitchen table and was now, if not gone, at least aware of its own edges. He did not look at Catherine when he entered. Then after a moment he did. It was a brief look, controlled and unreadable in the way he had always been unreadable. But she caught something in it she had never seen in 30 years of reading his face. A flicker of something adjacent to shame, quickly managed, quickly gone. The hearing lasted 19 minutes. The judge reviewed the settlement documents that Sandra and Patterson had finalized the previous week, asked 3 procedural questions, confirmed that both parties had signed voluntarily and with legal representation, and signed the dissolution order with a pen that scratched audibly in the quiet room. 27 years ended in the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee. Richard stood first. He aligned the chair back under the table with a precise habitual motion, the gesture of a man who needed the small environment around him to be orderly when the larger one was not. He picked up his briefcase. He turned toward the door, and then with his hand on the push bar, he stopped and looked back across the room at Catherine with an expression she had no existing category for. Not regret in the sentimental sense, not apology exactly, but the particular expression of a person who has just finished calculating the full cost of a decision and arrived at a number larger than expected. He nodded once. She held his gaze without returning the nod, not from cruelty, but from honesty. Some gestures required more than she currently had available to give. Then he pushed through the door and was gone. Gerald was waiting in the corridor outside, standing near the window at the end of the hall, where the October light came through in a long pale rectangle across the floor. He had a leather folio under one arm and his phone in his hand, and when Catherine came through the door, he looked at her with the focused attention of someone monitoring for the exact moment a process completes. "It's done," she said. He opened the folio and turned his phone screen toward her. The Whitfield Capital Group Consolidated Account Summary. A page she had looked at twice before in Gerald's office and once on Nathan's tablet, but which now carried a different weight because the legal condition attached to it had just been satisfied in a room 40 feet away. The number had not changed. $2.1 billion held in her name fully and irrevocably. The second great turning point of her life arrived not as an explosion, but as a door closing softly behind her, and another one opening ahead. And the difference between the two was so quiet and so complete that for a moment she simply stood in the corridor and breathed. "Your father would be..." Gerald began. "I know," she said. She wasn't being abrupt. She simply meant it completely, and they both understood that. She took out her own phone and called Nathan. The news broke 2 days later through a formal press release that Catherine and Nathan had prepared together, a single announcement, precise and minimal, confirming Catherine Whitmore as Whitfield Capital Group's new controlling shareholder. The release contained no personal narrative, no mention of the divorce, no drama. It was the announcement Harold Whitfield would have written himself. What it could not control was what journalists did with it. By afternoon, the story had crossed from financial media into general news, and by the time Diane called at 6 o'clock, it had reached the kind of velocity that meant Catherine's name was appearing in searches she had not initiated and conversations she was not part of. The headline that seemed to travel furthest was both accurate and reductive in the way that headlines always were. Whitfield Capital names new billionaire CEO weeks after her divorce. Catherine read it once, set her phone face down on the kitchen counter of the apartment that had become over the past 2 months genuinely hers, not a temporary shelter from loss, but a place she had chosen with the particular satisfaction of a woman furnishing a space according to no preference but her own. The couch was the color of old linen. The kitchen shelves held her father's cast iron skillet, which she had taken from the Laurelhurst house on her last visit, and which had seemed in the moment the most important thing to salvage. She turned the phone back over when it rang. "Richard." She answered because she had decided somewhere in the last 2 months that she was not going to manage her life by avoiding things. His voice carried a texture she had not heard from him in years, possibly ever. A flatness that was not his professional control, but something beneath it. The sound of a person who has run out of angles from which to approach a problem and is simply standing in front of it. "I saw the announcement," he said. "I know. The trust. When your father set it up, did he know about me specifically?" It was the most honest question he had asked her in a long time, possibly the most honest question he was capable of asking, and she considered it seriously. He had concerns, she said. He didn't know how things would go. He prepared for possibilities. Richard was quiet for a moment. He prepared for me. He prepared for whoever I might have married if that person turned out to be the wrong choice. She paused. You made yourself the right answer to his question. The silence that followed was long enough that she thought he might have ended the call. Then, I've been told the bar inquiry is moving forward. I know. I didn't expect that. I didn't file it. Another silence. I know you didn't. He said it in a way that suggested he had already investigated this, had already confirmed it, and the confirmation had produced a discomfort more complex than anger would have. Being the cause of your own consequences without the relief of a villain to blame. This was a particular kind of reckoning that Richard Whitmore had not previously had occasion to experience, and she could hear him working through the edges of it in real time. I made a series of decisions, he said finally, that I understood to be rational and that turned out to be the most expensive mistakes of my professional life. A pause, and my personal one. Catherine looked out the window of her apartment at the October afternoon. The maples along the street had turned fully the color of them, almost aggressive in the gray light, that particular Pacific Northwest autumn that pushed back against the rain with everything it had. Ambition isn't the same as wisdom, she said. You can be very good at acquiring things and still not understand their value. He didn't respond to that immediately. When he did, his voice had lost the last of its professional casing. I think I knew on some level that I was leaving something I couldn't replace. I think I knew, and I did it anyway because I'd convinced myself that knowing was the same as understanding. Another pause. It isn't. She had not expected to feel anything particular in this conversation. She was surprised to find that what she felt was not satisfaction, but something closer to sorrow. The specific sorrow of watching someone arrive at a truth 27 years too late to do anything useful with it.
It's so good to
I hope
see
the
you.
inquiry
You
resolves
too.
reasonably,
I've missed our
she
chats.
said. I mean
Me
that.
too. We should do this more often.
I know you do, he said. That's the part I'm having the hardest time with. The call ended. She stood at the window for a while after watching the maples, thinking about her father, who had known that the most powerful things don't announce themselves, and who had built a $2 billion proof of that principle and hidden it inside a modest monthly deposit for 22 years, waiting for a Tuesday evening in September that he would never see. She visited the Whitfield Capital offices twice that week and sat in on strategy sessions with Nathan's division leads, listening more than she spoke, asking the kind of questions that revealed she had been absorbing the vocabulary of institutional finance for decades without a context in which to use it. On Thursday afternoon, Nathan walked her through the Seattle research facility via video call, the lead scientist explaining in careful, accessible language what their diagnostic tools could eventually mean for the 3 million Americans currently living with undetected early-stage neurological disease. Catherine listened to the scientist speak and thought about her grandfather Harold's father, who had lost himself incrementally to dementia in the last years of his life, and who had been the reason Harold started this particular investment, and who had therefore, in some distant and unplanned way, been part of the reason she was sitting in this room today. The chains of consequence that ran through her life were longer than you could ever see from inside them. The next Saturday morning, she encountered Richard in a grocery store on the east side, the neighborhood market they had both used for years, neither of them having yet reorganized their habits around the new geography of their separate lives. He was wearing a fleece jacket she had never seen before, clothes chosen without an audience in mind, and he looked like a man who had recently been relieved of a large and exhausting performance and had not yet decided what to do with the quiet that remained. I didn't expect to see you here, he said. And it was such an ordinary sentence, so stripped of the controlled register he had always used with her, that for a moment she simply looked at him. It's a neighborhood store, she said. We apparently still live in the same neighborhood. He managed a brief, rueful smile. Brooke moved out, he said. I assume you know that. Diane mentioned it. She figured out that the person she thought she was with and the person she was actually with weren't the same. She wasn't wrong about that. He looked at the Apple display without seeing it. I've been doing a lot of thinking about that particular gap between who I told people I was and who I was actually being. Catherine placed 2 apples in her basket. She was not going to make this easier for him by filling his silences, but she was also not going to make it harder. I spent 30 years building a version of success that was entirely about external confirmation, he said. Cases 1, revenue generated. The right table at the right restaurant. I thought that was what a life was supposed to look like from the inside, and it took losing. He paused, chose the word deliberately. Everything I actually had to understand that I'd been measuring with the wrong instrument the whole time. That's an expensive education, she said. $2 billion worth roughly. The self-awareness in his voice was new and genuine. You look different, he added. Not physically, something else. I feel different, she said. And it was true in a way that was difficult to articulate, not the difference of having acquired something, but the difference of having stopped pretending that what she had was less than it was. She had spent 27 years in a marriage that required her to be smaller than she was, and she had complied so naturally, so completely, that she had genuinely forgotten she was doing it. The forgetting was the thing that had taken the longest to undo. I hope the company becomes what your father wanted it to be, Richard said. The sincerity in his voice was real enough that she accepted it without qualification. I think you always knew what mattered. I just never took the time to understand what you were actually doing with that knowledge. She looked at him for a moment, this man she had loved for nearly 3 decades, who had been brilliant and blind in equal measure, who had mistaken her simplicity for limitation and her patience for weakness, and had organized an entire exit strategy around a model of her that had never been accurate. He was standing in a grocery store in a fleece jacket with the bewildered, newly undefended expression of a person who has just taken off armor. They had been wearing so long they forgot it was armor. She felt something settle in her chest. Not forgiveness in the sense of erasing, but forgiveness in the original sense of the word, the sense of releasing a grip, setting something down because you no longer need to carry it. Take care of yourself, Richard, she said. She meant it fully and without qualification. Then she picked up her basket and walked toward the next aisle, and she did not look back. The idea for the Whitfield Foundation for Arts and Applied Learning began as a conversation between Catherine and Nathan in early November, sitting in the conference room after the rest of the team had gone home. She had been thinking about the community center, about the Seattle Research Facility, about the applied technology schools in rural Montana and Kentucky and West Virginia, about the thread that ran through all of Harold's investments, which was the conviction that the most important work happened in the places and the people that capital usually passed over. She had been doing that work herself for 20 years on a Wednesday afternoon scale. She wanted to do it on a different scale now, using the instrument her father had built. The foundation would direct a portion of Whitfield Capital's annual returns toward arts integration programs in underfunded community centers across the Pacific Northwest, beginning with the Eastside Community Arts Center in Portland, beginning with a single room, beginning with the children who were already there. Nathan listened to her outline it and was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then, Harold proposed something similar once years ago. He said the arts were where you could see what a person was actually capable of before they had the language to describe it. He paused. He said you were the proof of that. She had not known that either. The information landed in the same deep place as the painting on his office wall, and she understood that her father had spent 30 years watching her from a careful distance, seeing things she couldn't see about herself, and building a structure that would eventually give her the means to act on them. The first Whitfield Foundation classroom opened on a Thursday morning in December. in a room painted the particular shade of yellow that Catherine had chosen herself from a color card she had been carrying in her bag for weeks, waiting for the right walls. North-facing windows, Gerald had insisted, revealing an unexpectedly strong opinion about natural light in creative spaces. Supply cabinets full of the good materials, tables at the right height for children. Catherine arrived early and stood in the empty room alone for a few minutes before anyone else arrived, looking at the light coming through the new windows, the way it fell across the freshly painted walls, and the clean wooden tables, and the glass jars of brushes lined up along the supply shelf. Her father had kept a painting she made in college on his office wall for 30 years. He had looked at it every day, had carried it through the reorganizations of a long professional life, had thought it worth keeping in the place where he spent most of his waking hours. She had spent 27 years believing that her work existed in a separate and lesser register from the world of capital and consequence. She understood now that this belief had been installed in her by someone who needed her to hold it, and that her father had spent 40 years building a proof of the opposite. The children arrived in a group pulled from their regular classrooms by Margaret, with the conspiratorial energy of a surprise being delivered. Connor came in near the front, the 9-year-old who had flooded his paper with water and made a sky by accident. And when he saw Catherine standing in the room, his face produced the specific unguarded delight of a child who has not yet learned to manage his expressions for an audience. "Miss Cat." He ran the last few steps, stopping just short of collision with the instinct of a child who has been told many times not to run inside. "They named it after you." "They did," she said. "Why?" She thought about this seriously because Connor was the kind of child who deserved serious answers. "Because someone gave me something important," she said, "and I wanted to use it for something that lasts." Connor considered this with the grave evaluating attention he applied to everything. "Like the sky painting," he said. "Exactly like that." Diane was standing near the doorway, and when Catherine glanced over, Diane's expression contained everything they had said to each other over the past 3 months. And a great deal they hadn't needed to say at all. The particular eloquence of a long friendship, the kind that has been tested and found to hold. Nathan was there too, standing near the supply cabinet with the expression of someone seeing a thing they helped build finally become real. And Gerald, who had carried her father's hope in a filing cabinet for 22 years and was now watching it move through a room in the form of yellow walls and glass jars, and a 9-year-old boy talking about a sky painting. Catherine picked up a brush. She handed one to Connor. She pulled a stool to one of the wooden tables and set a fresh sheet of watercolor paper in front of her. The good kind 400-pound cold press. The kind that could take as much water as you gave it without buckling. She dipped the brush. She let the first wash of color spread across the page, not toward any specific image yet. Just the movement of pigment in water. The way color finds its own edges when you give it room. This was what her father had understood about her and had protected for her, while she was too busy surviving her life to protect it herself. Not the money, not the company, not the portfolio, not the billion-dollar proof of a philosophy built across 40 years. Those were the instrument. This was the thing. The instrument was for the particular quality of attention she brought to a room with children and paint and the specific light of a December morning coming through north-facing windows. She had spent 27 years in a marriage that required her to believe her work was small. She understood now that nothing her father had ever built was as precise or as deliberate as the Tuesday afternoons she had protected for 20 years against every pressure that said they didn't count. The most powerful things don't announce themselves. She had been the proof of that principle all along. And she simply hadn't known it yet, because no one in her immediate life had been paying the kind of attention that made knowing possible. Harold Whitfield had been paying that attention for 30 years, from across whatever distance fathers maintain, to let their children become themselves. He had watched her. He had understood what he saw. And he had built something that would wait patient and invisible until she was ready to receive it. Around her, the room filled with the particular sound of children beginning the scrape of stools, the soft percussion of brushes tapping against water jars, the low, concentrated murmur of people making things. Connor was already working beside her, his tongue pressed to his lower lip in concentration, his brush moving with the focused abandon of a child who has been given permission to find out what happens. Outside the north windows, the December sky over Portland was doing what December skies did, layering gray over gray, building toward rain. The light flat and honest and complete. Catherine looked at it for a moment. Then she looked back at her paper, where the first wash of color was still moving, still finding its edges, still becoming whatever it was going to be. She dipped her brush again. She kept working. The most powerful things don't announce themselves, and neither do the most important moments of her life. They arrive in kitchens on Tuesday evenings, and in courtroom corridors, and in grocery store produce sections, and in rooms painted the color of early morning. And they ask nothing of you except that you be present enough to understand what they are giving you and honest enough to accept it without flinching. She had learned in the end what her father had always known, that freedom is not something you are given. It is something you discover was already yours, once the thing that was obscuring it finally moves out of the way. She painted. Around her, the children painted. The December light held. The story continued.